Hi, everybody. We are going to get into hate crimes today. So, hate crimes are a victimization that occurs based specifically out of hate for a group that is targeted based on their gender, their ethnicity, their sexuality, their race, their religion, any of those categories. Hate crimes are much more likely to be violent rather than nonviolent relative to non-related hate crimes. And we didn't always have this category of crime. This is, it's not that new. It's been around for a good 35 years, but it didn't exist. Prior to the existence or the introduction of hate crimes, it was just a violent crime. But we saw the introduction of hate crimes, brought onto the scene as a result of the Matthew Shepard case. And the Matthew Shepard case was an incident in the 90s where a homosexual male was at a bar. He was young, I think he was late teens, early 20s. He left the bar with two other people that had been at the bar. They lured him out into a country area where they beat him till the point that he was dying, and then they tied him to a fence. Later that morning, somebody was out for a morning jog, and they saw a figure slumped over on the fence. They thought it was a scarecrow, but as they got closer, they realized it was a human being that had been terribly beaten. They called the ambulance. They got Matthew Shepard to the hospital where he subsequently died of his injuries. This was a crime that became, it took on national news. There was a national awareness of it. There was national outcry at the actions of the perpetrators and the fact that their consequences were limited just to a violent crime. And so hate crimes were born. That the idea that if you are targeting somebody for violence based off of a category that they affiliate with, like their sexual orientation or their gender or their religion or their race, that not only will you be punished for the violent crime itself, but that you will also be punished on top of that for the hate crime, that it is driven by a targeted hate towards a specific group. That secondary application of another charge means that your consequence isn't going to stop with the sentence for the violent crime. There's going to be an additional sentence for the hate crime on top of it. And usually that application of the hate crime sentence is quite lengthy. It's meant to punish severely for those who engage in hate crimes, but also to deter future hate crimes. So how does law enforcement determine or distinguish the difference between just a regular violent crime versus a hate crime? Well, they look for things, or if they see a presence of some of the following, they realize this isn't just a violent exchange. This is a targeted violent exchange. So if they see things like symbols that are utilized to indicate hate, things like the presence of swastikas, they look at the timing of the attack. Did the victimization take place on a day that's significant to a group, like a religious group, or something of that capacity? Does the perpetrator have a demonstrable history of violent crimes, or hate speech towards specific groups? Do they have previous attacks on specific groups? Have they been known to talk about, openly and negatively with other people or on social media about their hate for a specific group? Fortunately, hate crimes are not very common. According to the NCVS, 1% of all victims report being a victim of a hate crime. So they're very rare, and that's a good thing. And it also, would indicate to some extent that, a couple of things, that society is more inclusive than it ever has been in the past, and accepting of differences, of individual differences from person to person. But it would also indicate that perhaps the deterrent value of those hate crime sentencing is working, that people are aware that if I act on hate, I'm not just going to go away for a few years for assault. I'm going to go away for a few years for assault and maybe an extra 10 years on top of that for a hate crime violation. Just a few specifics here. Hispanic people are more likely than any other demographic to fall victim to hate crimes, and hate crimes mostly fall in urban settings. Young people are most likely to be the victims of hate crimes than are anybody over the age of 25. So hate crimes are really targeted for people under the age of 25. And like I said, the legislative and the legal response to this was to add what I call a multiplier, that not only are you going to be sentenced for the original assault, and if the assault results in a homicide, you're going to be sentenced for the homicide, but you're also going to get an additional sentence on top of both of those charges and sentences for a hate crime, which gives a multiplier. It really extends that prison sentence, which gives hate crimes legislation a lot of teeth. There's a lot of teeth to that in order to protect victims who could be targeted for hate crimes. Shifting gears, let's talk about human trafficking. Human trafficking has been on the radar in the United States more so now than ever throughout the history of the United States. There's just a lot of awareness of how prevalent it is across the globe, but even more so domestically here in the United States. We have a serious problem with human trafficking. There are multiple categories of human trafficking. Perhaps the largest category and the most recognized category is going to be human sex trafficking, where children and adults are forced into, they're essentially, kidnapped and or forced into prostitution at the hands of sex traffickers. And they are usually taken from the geographic locale in which they live. They're relocated somewhere else, either domestically, in some cases overseas in other countries, where they are forced to engage in prostitution. If they try to escape, if they refuse to comply, they'll be beaten, they'll be killed. And it is not at all uncommon for traffickers to force drug use onto these children, these adolescents, and these adults to put them into a state of addiction. And therefore, the only way they can they become physically dependent, they go into withdrawal, and the only way they can get more substance is by engaging in this prostitution, and they'll be rewarded by their traffickers by giving them their next fix so that they can stay out of withdrawal symptoms. And it becomes a very vicious thing. There are, like I said, all ages of people are involved in human sex trafficking, from, unfortunately and tragically, babies all the way through all age groups. And again, this is all done for financial profit. Sex traffickers are getting paid to force these people into sexual slavery. In addition to human sex trafficking, there is also the category of labor trafficking, which is also very, very common, and it is proliferating here in the United States, especially as immigrant waves come into the United States. Many of the people coming in as immigrants who do not come in through the formal visa process are paying traffickers that we call them coyotes. The coyotes say, hey, I'll get you into the United States. You give me a certain amount of money. Or you don't have to give me money. You have to work off your debt. And when you get to the United States, I'll get you a job, and you hand over the money that you make to me until you pay off the fee that you owe me for getting you here. The problem there is, obviously this is illegal in many shapes and forms, but the problem there is that that fee becomes a moving target. And they never make it clear to the individual how much that fee is. They just keep collecting the money, and that fee never seems to decrease. And ultimately, these people end up in forced slave labor, which we call debt bondage, where they're working for years and years and handing over their paycheck, thinking that someday they're going to be freed from this bondage and go make their way to the American dream, but they're never going to be released. And if people who try to get out of this circumstance are beaten, are killed, etc., by those labor traffickers. So sex traffic victims are forced to work, like I said, in prostitution. They're also forced to work in strip clubs. They are forced to work in massage parlors that also, double as brothels for prostitution. And this is a global problem, but it is also a concentrated problem here in the United States. So we have both sex trafficking and labor trafficking within our borders, and we've got a huge, huge problem with it, and it's an interstate problem. And, the United States is known literally for the fact that we have this wonderful infrastructure of our interstate highways. Many countries do not have such infrastructure, but unfortunately, traffickers are taking advantage of this. And just like we traffic goods from state to state, to get to stores, to get to consumers, unfortunately, human beings are being trafficked from state to state through the interstate in the same capacity. There's domestic trafficking, like I told you, is everything that happens within our borders, but there's also something called transnational trafficking. And that's where victims are going to be removed from their domestic country. They're going to be forcibly removed and kidnapped, or they're going to be coerced into leaving on the promise of a better life, a job elsewhere that I have waiting for you in this other country. And when they get to the other country, they're forced into sex trafficking or labor trafficking by physical force, by threat of death, etc. Females make up 94% of all victims in sex trafficking, and they make up 64% of all victims of labor trafficking. So females are much more likely to fall victim to this than are males. Roughly half of all trafficked victims for both categories of debt bondage and sexual trafficking, half of them are under the age of 18 years old. So kids, adolescents, children, all the way down to toddlers, are targeted for this because it's easier to obtain compliance and control over them while they are young. And as they get older, having lived under the circumstance and the fear of physical harm and the fear of death, it becomes much easier to control them and to keep them in the system throughout the course of their lives. So traffickers really target very young people, very young children, because they're easier to control long term. There's two categories of countries. There are source countries and destination countries. Source countries are countries that are going to be known for people being kidnapped and trafficked outside of their borders and relocated somewhere else. Source countries are going to be countries that are just not, they're very lax on trying to crack down on trafficking. The traffickers know this, so they go specifically to those countries because they know that they can largely take people out with impunity. An example of this would be Russia. Russia is a very well-known source country. They don't have a lot of barriers, legal barriers in place, or legal sanctions in place. So traffickers go there knowing that they can operate largely with impunity, get a slave workforce, and get them outside of Russian borders to relocate them elsewhere. There are also what we call destination countries, and these are the countries that have the highest demand for victims. So these are the countries that the traffickers who go to the source countries and they take the people out of the source countries, these are the countries where they take those people because there's high demand for either slave labor or there's high demand for an illegal sex trade. Multiple countries are involved, are source countries, or excuse me, destination countries. But I'm sad to say that the United States is number 2 worldwide. We are the largest country for demand for sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The only country that beats us in demand is Germany. Germany and the United States are the 2 biggest destination countries for trafficking, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Poverty is the largest risk factor for becoming trafficked, as many trafficked victims are, they're promised work, they're promised a better life somewhere else. If you just come with me to this location, you're going to live better than you've ever lived. When in fact, when they actually, they willingly go under this promise, when they get there, they live worse than they've ever lived because now not only are they still living in poverty, but now they're living in slavery under the threat of physical force and murder. Okay. The primary responses that we have to people who are sex trafficked or labor trafficked and they're taken outside of their country is to identify, first of all, that they're trafficking victims and to repatriate them. We want to get them back to their native country, to a free living circumstance. The United States response to sex trafficking, we do have a response. We need to build the response much, much larger than it currently exists, but we do have a process underway. And that process is known as certification. So victims of sex trafficking can become certified. And if they become certified under this program, which happens through the Department of Homeland Security, they can pursue what we call refugee status, that they are a refugee, that they are not safe based off of their trafficking status. They're not safe in their original country because they were forced out of their country into human trafficking. So we will give them refugee status in the United States, providing them asylum and safety, but only if they follow the following criteria. So first, they have to provide proof that they have in fact been human trafficked in some capacity. Second, they have to be willing to, participate in the prosecution of their captors. They can't, choose to just say, hey, I was trafficked, come give me asylum, I want to go away now. No, they have to help our agencies, our law enforcement agencies, our federal agencies pursue the people who kidnap them and traffic them so that we can identify other victims, we can free other victims, and we can keep those captors from continuing to work and continuing to bring other people into different forms of slavery into the United States. And finally, they must pursue a visa. And they have to commit long term to working with the Department of Homeland Security on this issue of trafficking. Why? Because human trafficking in the U.S. is such a gargantuan problem, and we are really playing catch up in terms of law enforcement that we need people to participate with us, people who have been on the inside, who know the processes, who know the people who work there and proliferate these problems to continue to try and get this massive, massive juggernaut of a human rights violation under control. The law enforcement response to sex trafficking victims is changing as well. We've often looked at prostitution as a vice crime. We pursue both the person who solicits and the solicitor. So we pursue legally, we pursue the prostitute and the person paying the prostitute. But as we are becoming more aware of human trafficking and we are realizing, hey, there are a lot of women who are working in prostitution and men and children working in prostitution, and it's not their choice. They're not choosing to do this. They are being forced to do this by threat of physical harm and threat of death. So it's really inappropriate for us to pursue them criminally. They're working against their will. Their human rights are being violated. They are victims. They are not perpetrators of crime. They are being victimized. So more and more we are identifying when we pursue vice crimes like prostitution, we're looking to identify first, is this person a victim? Do they need help? Rather than this person's prostituting, let's arrest them and prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. So we have a change in perception and a change in legal approach. And currently, another big area that is just lacking is that we have a lack of adequate victim services and programs for people that we find who have been trafficked in sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Once again, we're really behind the ball on this. Hopefully, with time and as awareness of this issue grows, those services will begin to grow and spread more and get greater funding so that we can assist people who are caught in labor trafficking and human trafficking and find ways to get those victims out of that circumstance and get them into a healthy, free lifestyle.